He said it casually, like he was commenting on the weather. He leaned back in his chair, looked around the room, and said I was uneducated and worthless. Not angry, not emotional, calm, confident. Like it was a fact everyone already agreed on. A few people laughed, not loudly, but enough. I felt my stomach drop. I was standing near the door, holding a glass I hadn't taken a sip from, suddenly very aware that every eye had shifted toward me. He didn't look at me after that. He didn't need to. The damage was already done. I stayed quiet because I had learned that reacting only made things worse. He liked reactions. He liked knowing he could control the room with a sentence. If I argued, I would look defensive. If I walked out, I would look weak. So I stood there, nodded once, and pretended it didn't matter. Inside, though, something cracked, not loudly, just enough to change how I saw him. At that moment, the risk wasn't just humiliation. I lived under his roof. He paid the bills. Every favor came with strings I couldn't see until they tightened. One wrong move and I could lose my place, my stability, the little space I had carved out for myself. I had no backup plan that anyone knew about. And he knew that, or at least he thought he did. What made it worse was the timing. This wasn't a private argument. This was in front of relatives I hadn't seen in years. People who would go home and retell the story, trimming it into something smaller and sharper. I could already hear it. He didn't do much with his life. His father tried. That night wasn't just about words. It was about who controlled the story of who I was. I grew up being measured against expectations I didn't choose. School didn't go the way it was supposed to. I left early. I worked jobs that didn't impress anyone. I stopped explaining myself because explanations turned into debates, and debates always ended the same way. He liked clear paths, degrees, titles. I liked building things quietly, even if no one clapped for it. This happened in the same house where every decision had his stamp on it. To the outside world, he was respected, generous, the kind of person people asked for advice. To me, he was someone who needed to feel bigger by making me smaller. That night mattered because it confirmed something I had been avoiding for years. He wasn't disappointed in me, he was invested in my failure. The first real consequence came fast. Conversations shifted away from me. People avoided eye contact. Someone asked me if I was figuring things out in that careful voice people use when they already think they know the answer. I smiled, excused myself, and stepped outside. The air was cold. I stood there longer than necessary, pretending to check my phone, wondering how long I could keep pretending this didn't affect me. Later, when everyone had gone, he acted like nothing happened. He asked me to help him with something small, like we were back to normal. I did it. I didn't argue. But something had changed. I wasn't trying to earn my place anymore. I was counting days without knowing why yet. That night, lying awake, I realized the worst part wasn't what he said. It was that he believed I would never be able to prove him wrong, and that assumption was about to become a problem. The days after that night felt heavier than usual. Not because he kept insulting me, but because he didn't need to. The silence did the work for him. He watched me more closely, asked questions that sounded casual but weren't. What time I was coming back, who I was talking to, why I stayed up late. I answered carefully, keeping things short. Every word felt like it could be used later. One afternoon he asked me what my plans were, not for the day, for life. He said it like he was being helpful. I told him I was working on something. He smiled in a way that wasn't warm. He said he hoped it wasn't another phase. He reminded me how much he'd invested in me already. Food, shelter, time, tea. His message was clear. Everything I had came from him, and he expected something in return. Gratitude, obedience, silence. That same week he corrected me in front of someone again. Smaller this time. A comment about how I handled a simple task. He laughed it off, but I noticed how he waited for a reaction. I didn't give him one. I kept my hands busy, focused on finishing what I was doing. The person watching shifted uncomfortably. When they left, he told me I needed thicker skin. I nodded. Inside, I started planning. The pressure showed up in practical ways. He delayed giving me money he usually didn't question. He reminded me of expenses out loud, as if reading from a list. Electricity, internet, food. Each word landed like a warning. I adjusted, cut back, ate less, stayed out longer. I needed to make myself smaller in ways that wouldn't attract attention. At night, I worked quietly, laptop dimmed, headphones on. I backed up files twice, once online, once offline. I didn't label folders clearly. I didn't talk about what I was doing. Not because it was illegal or wrong, but because I knew the moment he sensed progress, he'd want control. He always did. One evening, he walked into my room without knocking. His eyes moved too quickly. Desk, screen, bags. He asked what I was working on. I closed the laptop and said it was nothing important. He stood there a second longer than necessary, then left. I waited until I heard his door close before breathing properly again. The consequence of all this wasn't just fear, it was clarity. I stopped hoping for approval. I stopped explaining myself in my head. I understood that staying invisible was no longer protection. It was a delay. And delays have a cost. A few days later, an email came in, short, formal, confirming something I'd been waiting on for months. I read it 3 times to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding it. My hands were shaking, but not from fear this time, from timing, because now I had proof. Not enough to show, not enough to celebrate, but enough to change the balance if I played it right. And if I played it wrong, he'd crush it before it ever mattered. After that email, everything felt louder even when no one was speaking. Every sound in the house made me tense. Footsteps in the hallway, a door opening, his voice on the phone. I kept replaying the same thought in my head. He can't know. Not yet. Knowing too early was worse than not knowing at all. He sensed the shift anyway. He always did. He started asking indirect questions, the kind designed to trap you into revealing more than you meant to. He asked why I seemed busy all of a sudden. He joked about how people like me usually overestimate their abilities. He framed it as concern, but the timing was deliberate. He was checking to see if I was still small. One afternoon he called me into the living room. He was sitting comfortably, relaxed, like he already had the upper hand. He said he'd been thinking about my future, said maybe it was time I accepted reality. He suggested options that kept me dependent, helping him more, cutting back on whatever distractions I had. He spoke slowly, as if explaining something obvious to a child. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I said I'd think about it. That answer annoyed him more than an argument would have. The consequence came that same evening. The internet went out in my room, not the whole house, just mine. He said it was probably a wiring issue. He didn't offer to fix it. I used my phone hotspot instead, careful with every minute. It wasn't about the connection, it was about reminding me how easily things could be taken away. I adapted again, I changed routines. I worked from different locations when I could. I kept copies of everything where he couldn't reach them. I stopped assuming privacy existed at all. The fear was still there, but it had sharpened into something useful. Focus, then something small but important happened. A conversatio. I overheard by accident. He was talking about me to someone else, not angrily, casually, describing me as someone who never followed through, someone who needed guidance, someone who would always need help. I stood still, listening, realizing this wasn't frustration, it was narrative. He had decided who I was and he was selling that version to others. That was the moment I understood the real danger. It wasn't losing money or housing, it was losing control over my own story. If he finished telling it for me, nothing I did later would matter. That night, I opened the email again. I reread every line. I checked deadlines, requirements, next steps. There was no room for hesitation anymore. Staying quiet was no longer neutral. It was a choice that benefited him. I didn't confront him. I didn't hint. I didn't celebrate. I moved forward silently, knowing that the next phase wouldn't be about surviving insults. It would be about surviving interference. The shift didn't happen all at once. It showed up in small interruptions, tiny obstacles that looked harmless on their own. A document I needed suddenly went missing. A deadline changed without explanation. Someone stopped replying to emails that had been moving smoothly just days earlier. At first, I told myself it was normal. Then I noticed the pattern. Every delay pointed back to him. He didn't confront me directly, that wasn't his style. Instead, he positioned himself as the filter between me and the world. He offered to help by speaking on my behalf. He said it would save me embarrassment. I declined politely. His smile tightened. He reminded me again who had experience and who didn't. I thanked him and left the room. My heart was racing, but my steps stayed even. The pressure increased. He started checking my schedule more aggressively. If I left early, he wanted to know why. If I came back late, he wanted details. He framed it as concern for my well-being. I responded with less information each time. That made him uneasy. I could see it in the way he lingered near my door, listening. Then came the first real threat. Not shouted. Not dramatic. He said if I was wasting time on fantasies, maybe it was time I paid my own way completely. Rent, utilities, everything. He didn't give a deadline. He didn't need to. The uncertainty was the weapon. I nodded and said I understood. That night, I moved what little cash I had into a separate account he didn't know about. A few days later, I learned he'd made a call. Not to expose me outright, but to plant doubt. Someone I depended on for progress suddenly questioned my credibility. They asked things they hadn't asked before. I recognized his phrasing in their tone. Calm, doubtful, final. The consequence hit immediately. A meeting was postponed. Opportunities don't announce when they're slipping away, they just go quiet. I almost confronted him then. Almost. Instead, I asked for clarification from the other side. I provided proof. Not everything, just enough. It worked, but barely. I realized how close I was to losing ground I couldn't easily recover. That scared me more than anything he'd said so far. At home, he acted satisfied, too satisfied. He commented on how relaxed I looked, like he'd already won. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat there replaying every move, every word. I understood now that this wasn't about discipline or disappointment. It was about control. If I succeeded without him, his version of himself collapsed. By morning, I made a decision. I would stop assuming he couldn't reach into places I hadn't told him about. I would move faster, cleaner. I would treat every interaction like it mattered because it did, and if he wanted to escalate quietly, I was ready to respond the same way. From that point on, I treated every day like I was already on my own. I stopped relying on anything he could touch. I rerouted mail. I changed where I worked. I memorized numbers instead of saving them. It sounds paranoid, but when someone has power over your basics, caution stops being optional. It becomes survival. He noticed the distance immediately. He started filling the silence with commentary. He talked about people who failed because they thought they were smarter than they were. He mentioned stories about others who learned the hard way. None of it was aimed directly at me, but every word was chosen carefully. He wanted me to doubt myself without giving me something I could argue against. Then he tried a different angle. He offered help again, this time more forcefully. He said he could make a call that would smooth things over. He implied that whatever I was working toward would go faster with his name attached. I understood the trap. If I let him in now, the success would never be mine, and if it failed, the blame would be. I thanked him and said I had it handled. He didn't hide his irritation. The next consequence came from outside the house. Someone I was coordinating with asked me directly whether I had support at home. Not emotionally, structurally. They said it carefully, but the message was clear. Instability scared them. I chose my words even more carefully than usual. I didn't lie, but I didn't explain either. I said I was transitioning. That was enough to keep the door open, but only just. At home, he escalated again. He moved my things without asking. Not enough to be obvious, just enough to let me know he'd been there. When I mentioned it, he laughed and said I was imagining things. I stopped mentioning it after that. I started documenting instead. Dates, times, small details. Not because I planned to use them, but because keeping track made me feel grounded. One evening, he cornered me in the kitchen. He asked me directly what I thought I was doing. His voice was calm, but his posture wasn't. He stood too close. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't explain. I said I was working. That was it. He stared at me for a long moment, then stepped back and smiled. He said I'd always been stubborn. He walked away like the conversation was over, but it wasn't. That night I realized how thin the margin was. One wrong step, one slip, and he could still shut everything down. I also realized something else. He was reacting. Not guiding, not correcting. Reacting. That meant he was no longer ahead of me. He was trying to catch up without letting it show. For the first time, the fear shifted direction. The moment I realized he was reacting instead of leading, everything shifted. I stopped moving defensively and started moving deliberately. Not loudly, not boldly, just precisely. I tightened timelines. I double-checked submissions. I followed up faster than necessary. I made sure that if anything stalled, it wouldn't be because of me. He tried one last angle. He questioned my confidence instead of my actions. He said people like me often mistake luck for ability. He warned me about embarrassment if things fell apart. He spoke slowly, carefully, like he was offering wisdom. I listened, nodded, and said nothing. When I walked away, I felt his eyes on my back. That used to scare me. Now it confirmed something. He was unsure. A few days later, I got confirmation that something had moved forward despite the interference. Not fully approved, not finished, but undeniably alive. I didn't celebrate. I saved the message, backed it up, and deleted the notification. Progress was something I treated like a fragile object now. Useful only if protected. At home, tension thickened. He became quieter, more watchful. He stopped making jokes about me in front of others. That silence wasn't peace. It was calculation. I overheard him on the phone again, this time sounding irritated. He mentioned me briefly, dismissively, like he wanted to close the topic. That told me more than any insult ever had. The consequence showed up when he tried to force a conversation. He asked me to sit down with him. He said we needed to clear the air. He framed it as our reconciliation. I agreed, but I stayed standing. He asked where I saw myself in a year. I answered honestly but vaguely. He pressed for details. I didn't give them. The more he pushed, the calmer I became. Eventually, he stopped asking questions and started talking instead. That told me who needed reassurance. After that, I started preparing for the inevitable moment when the truth would surface. Not as an announcement, as a fact. I organized everything so that when it happened, it wouldn't sound like a claim. It would sound like confirmation. That difference mattered more than I'd ever understood before. The fear didn't disappear, it just changed shape. It stopped being about whether I would fail and became about when the collision would happen. Because now there were two versions of me moving forward, the one he believed in, and the one quietly proving him wrong, and they couldn't exist in the same space much longer. The collision didn't come with shouting or slammed doors. It arrived quietly, the way real consequences usually do. A call I'd been waiting for finally came through, and this time it wasn't tentative. The tone was different, clear, confident. They confirmed what had already been building and outlined next steps without hesitation. I listened carefully, took notes, and thanked them. When the call ended, I sat still for a full minute, letting it settle. This was no longer something fragile. It had weight. He noticed the change in me before he knew why. I moved differently. Not faster, not slower, just steadier. I stopped adjusting my schedule around his. I stopped explaining where I was going. That loss of access bothered him more than any argument could have. He asked me what was going on. I told him I was handling something important. He asked if it involved him. I said no. The consequence was immediate. He raised his voice for the first time in weeks. He told me I was being disrespectful, that I was forgetting who supported me when no one else did. I didn't respond right away. I finished what I was doing, put my things down, and then looked at him. I told him I wasn't asking for permission anymore. My voice didn't shake. His did. He tried to reassert control the only way he knew how. He reminded me of everything he'd given me. He listed sacrifices. He implied debt. I listened, arms crossed, and realized something quietly devastating. None of it was about love. It was about leverage. And leverage only works when the other person still needs it. I didn't reveal anything yet. I didn't need to. The shift in power was already visible. He asked fewer questions. He interrupted less. He watched me like he was waiting for a mistake that didn't come. The silence between us stretched, heavy and unfamiliar. A few days later, the truth surfaced without my help. Someone congratulated me in front of him. Not loudly, casually, like it was common knowledge. I saw his expression change in real time. Confusion first, then calculation, then something close to fear. He laughed it off, asked what they meant. They explained briefly, factually. I stayed quiet. After that, he pulled me aside. He asked why I hadn't told him. I told him I didn't feel the need to. He stared at me, searching for the version of me he understood. It wasn't there anymore. The confrontation ended without resolution. No apology, no explosion. Just a long pause where both of us understood that the balance had shifted permanently, and for the first time, I wasn't waiting for his reaction. After that moment, the house felt unfamiliar, not hostile, not calm either, like a place that had lost its rules overnight. He avoided direct confrontation but stayed alert, as if waiting for someone to confirm what he had just learned. I didn't give him that. I didn't explain details. I didn't correct assumptions. I let the facts sit where they landed. He tried to regain footing by acting supportive. Suddenly, he was asking if I needed anything. If I wanted advice. If I needed introductions. The shift was obvious. A week earlier, I was a liability. Now I was a variable he hadn't planned for. I thanked him politely and kept my distance. Every offer felt like a delayed attempt to reattach strings. The real counterattack wasn't verbal. It was logistical. I finalized arrangements quietly. I secured what I needed without using his name or resources. I confirmed timelines. I locked in independence piece by piece. Each completed step made the next one easier. Momentum is powerful when no one is slowing you down. He noticed things leaving my room. Boxes, files, equipment. He asked if I was going somewhere. I said yes. He asked when. I said soon. That answer unsettled him more than a date would have. Uncertainty had finally switched sides. The final confrontation happened without planning. He cornered me near the door one evening, voice controlled but tight. He asked if everything he'd said about me had been wrong. Not apologetically, accusatory. I paused before answering. I told him it didn't matter anymore. That answer landed harder than any argument. He told me I was ungrateful. I nodded once and said maybe. Then I left. The consequence came fast and clean. I moved out within days, not dramatically, quietly. I didn't announce it. I didn't ask for approval. When I walked out for the last time, he stood in the doorway watching, saying nothing. He didn't try to stop me. Control only works when it's still possible. Outside, nothing felt triumphant, just lighter. I realized I had spent years shrinking myself to fit a story that wasn't mine. Walking away didn't rewrite the past, but it ended his ability to narrate my future, and that was enough. The days after I left were quieter than I expected. No dramatic fallout, no long messages, just distance. I focused on setting up my new routine, learning how to sit in silence without waiting for criticism. Simple things felt different, making decisions without explaining them, resting without guilt, moving forward without checking whether someone approved. He tried once more to reach out, but not directly. A short message passed through someone else. It said he was proud of me, that he always knew I had potential. I read it carefully, then put my phone down. The words felt misplaced, like they belonged to a different story, one where the years before hadn't happened. I didn't reply. People treated me differently now, not dramatically but subtly. Questions were asked with curiosity instead of pity. My name wasn't followed perfected by disclaimers anymore. The same relatives who once avoided eye contact now asked how I did it. I answered honestly, without drama. I said I stopped letting someone else define me. Some nodded, others looked uncomfortable. That told me everything. The strange part was the lack of victory. I hadn't won against him. I had simply stepped out of reach. There was no satisfaction in knowing he'd been wrong, only relief in knowing his opinion no longer shaped my choices. I realized that proving someone wrong doesn't always feel loud. Sometimes it feels like peace. I thought about that night again, the one where he called me uneducated and worthless in front of everyone. For the first time, the memory didn't sting. It felt distant, like something that happened to someone else. I understood then that the moment I stopped chasing his approval, his words lost their power. What stayed with me wasn't anger. It was clarity. Some people don't want you to grow unless they can claim credit for it. And when you do it without them, they don't know where to place you anymore. So here's the question I still sit with. If someone only respects you after you succeed, but worked to keep you small before that, do they deserve a place in your life at all?